The greatest love stories are not always written in candlelight. They are forged in the tension between devotion and doubt, between the desire to hold on and the fear of letting go. For Elvis Presley and Priscilla Beaulieu, that moment of truth came on a December night in 1966, just as Graceland glittered with the lights of Christmas. The king of rock and roll was 31, adored by millions but struggling with a career that felt increasingly hollow. The films he had poured himself into were formulaic, his music stagnant, and behind the sparkle of Hollywood, he wrestled with a haunting question: could fame and love coexist? Priscilla, only 21 at the time, had spent years in Elvis's world, living at Graceland since she was 17, adjusting to the pressures of being tied to a man adored worldwide. She had described those years as both magical and suffocating, a paradox of privilege and isolation. To the outside world, she was the chosen one, the woman who had captured the heart of a legend. But inside, she often wondered if she was seen as her own person, or merely as an accessory to his fame. Their relationship, 7 years deep, had reached a quiet crossroads. And then came Christmas. Elvis had prepared the usual extravagant gifts: jewelry, furs, luxuries that dazzled but did not satisfy the deeper needs of their bond. But on that night, as family gathered around the massive tree in Graceland's living room, he placed something in Priscilla's hands that was unlike anything she expected. Nestled inside a velvet box was a diamond engagement ring, 3.5 carats, flanked by 20 smaller diamonds, a symbol not just of love but of permanence, of stepping into a future together. It was more than a gift. It was a decision, a turning point. That moment transformed their love from a private devotion into a public vow. For Priscilla, it was the night her life changed forever, not just because she became Elvis's fiancée, but because she would soon carry the weight of being his partner in a world where love was tested by fame at every turn. By the winter of 1966, Elvis Presley stood at a crossroads. To the public, he was still the king of rock and roll, an icon with unmatched charisma, whose voice had redefined an era. But behind closed doors, the man beneath the crown was restless. His movie career, once a thrilling new chapter, had been reduced to formula scripts and predictable soundtracks. The raw energy that had electrified audiences in the 1950s seemed buried under layers of Hollywood polish. He confided to friends that he felt uninspired, trapped in a cycle that drained his creativity. For someone who had once lived for the fire of live performance, the silence of artistic stagnation weighed heavily. At the same time, his personal life was both a sanctuary and a struggle. Priscilla Beaulieu had lived at Graceland since she was 17, adjusting to the overwhelming reality of being tied to the most famous man in America. To outsiders, she seemed to live a dream life, surrounded by luxury, adored by Elvis, embraced by the Presley inner circle. But Priscilla herself would later describe those years as bittersweet. She was young, bright, and full of her own ambitions, yet her identity was often overshadowed by the gravitational pull of Elvis's fame. In her memoir, she revealed moments of feeling like a bird in a gilded cage, loved but confined, admired but not fully seen. Their love, however, was undeniable. Elvis adored Priscilla's quiet strength, her loyalty, and her ability to ground him in ways the world of fame never could. She, in turn, loved him deeply, even as she struggled with the sacrifices demanded of her. But by late 1966, after 7 years together, questions loomed between them. Unspoken but palpable, could their relationship remain suspended indefinitely, with her as the devoted companion and him as the untouchable star? Or would it evolve into something permanent, something binding? Elvis felt the pressure acutely. Friends close to him noticed his shifting demeanor, less carefree, more reflective. He was aware of the whispers, the expectations from family, from fans, even from Priscilla herself, though she rarely voiced them aloud. At 31, Elvis was no longer the boy from Tupelo chasing dreams. He was a man facing the responsibilities of love and the realities of time. And at 21, Priscilla stood at the threshold of womanhood, eager to be more than a figure in the background of his life. It was in this climate of uncertainty that Elvis began to plan something extraordinary. He knew that gifts of jewels and cars, as dazzling as they were, could no longer disguise the deeper need between them. Their relationship had reached its defining moment. Would he hold her at arm's length, keeping her as the girl waiting in Graceland while he drifted through Hollywood? Or would he take the step that would forever alter both their lives, committing not just in affection but in promise? As Christmas approached, Graceland came alive with festivity. Lights adorned the mansion, carols echoed in the halls, and the Presley household bustled with family and friends. But beneath the glitter, Elvis carried a secret, a gift that was more than a symbol. It was a decision that would end years of waiting, a declaration that he wanted Priscilla not just as his companion, but as his partner for life. Christmas at Graceland was always a grand affair. The mansion, already majestic, shimmered under twinkling lights that traced every rooftop and tree. Inside, the atmosphere was warm with laughter, music, and the fragrance of pine and cinnamon. For the Presley family, holidays were more than tradition. They were a chance to pause the chaos of Elvis's whirlwind career and gather together in celebration. Yet beneath the joyful exterior, this particular Christmas in 1966 carried a quiet anticipation. Elvis was holding something back, a secret he had carefully planned, a gesture that would redefine his future with Priscilla. The evening began as expected, with gifts exchanged around the towering tree in the living room. Elvis, known for his generosity, had already showered Priscilla with the kind of presents that dazzled the eye: jewelry, fine clothes, luxuries that spoke of wealth but not always of intimacy. But as the night went on, he reached for a small box, different from the rest. He held it in his hand for a moment, as though weighing its meaning before turning to her with uncharacteristic seriousness. "This one's special, Scylla," he said softly, using the nickname he had for her. His voice, usually so commanding in front of crowds, now carried a tremor of vulnerability. The room seemed to fall still as Priscilla opened the velvet box. Inside, a diamond sparkled beneath the glow of the Christmas lights, a 3.5-carat center stone encircled by 20 smaller diamonds, elegant yet striking. It was the kind of ring that left no doubt. Gasps filled the room, but Priscilla's silence spoke louder than anything. For years she had been the devoted partner, the young woman who had followed Elvis into a life that was both dazzling and confining. Now, with one gesture, he had made their bond official, permanent. Elvis reached for her hand, his eyes searching hers with a rare earnestness. "Will you marry me?" In that moment, the tension of years seemed to dissolve. Priscilla later described feeling overwhelmed, not only with joy, but with the weight of what the ring represented. It was not just a symbol of love, it was an acknowledgement of her place in his life, a promise that she was no longer simply the girl waiting at Graceland, but the woman he intended to build a future with. Yet, beneath the joy, there was also fear. Priscilla was only 21, stepping into a role that carried enormous responsibility. To marry Elvis Presley meant more than becoming a wife. It meant becoming the partner of a man whose every move was scrutinized by millions. She would be expected to hold her composure in the face of fame's relentless glare, to provide stability in a life that rarely knew peace. For Elvis, the proposal was not simply romance. It was also necessity. He had felt the distance creeping in, the unspoken questions pressing against their bond. By offering the ring, he was not only declaring his love, but also securing the relationship against the tides of uncertainty. This was his way of saying, "You are mine, and I am yours forever." As Priscilla slipped the ring onto her finger, the room erupted in celebration. But for the couple at the center of it all, the moment carried a gravity that few could understand. The gift was more than diamonds and gold. It was the culmination of 7 years of waiting, of sacrifices made, of doubts endured, and it was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would test not just their love, but their resilience as two people bound together under the brightest, and often harshest spotlight in the world. The days following that Christmas night felt different at Graceland. The engagement ring on Priscilla's hand was more than a sparkling accessory. It was a signal that everything had changed. For years she had been known as Elvis's girlfriend, the young woman who lived in his world, but was never quite acknowledged as belonging fully to it. Now, with one surprise gift, she had become his fiancée, her future sealed in the most public way imaginable. The news spread quickly, first among friends and family, then through the wider world. When word reached the press, headlines buzzed with fascination. Elvis Presley, the most desired man on earth, had chosen one woman to stand beside him for life. Fans reacted with a mix of excitement, curiosity, and even heartbreak. For Priscilla, it was a sobering reminder that her private relationship was now a matter of public interest. Her love story was no longer just her own. It belonged in some way to millions. Elvis, however, seemed relieved. For years he had resisted tying himself down, not because he doubted Priscilla's devotion, but because the weight of commitment felt heavy in a world where fame constantly threatened stability. Yet by 1966 he had come to a realization: love could not survive on half measures. The proposal was his way of making a promise not just to Priscilla but to himself, that he was ready to anchor his restless life with a foundation of permanence. For Priscilla, the turning point was more complex. On one hand, she was elated. She loved Elvis deeply, and the proposal confirmed that her sacrifices, leaving her family in Germany, moving into Graceland as a teenager, enduring long absences while he filmed or toured, had not been in vain. She was no longer waiting in the wings. She was stepping into the spotlight beside him, but with that joy came a swell of anxiety. Could she live up to the expectations of being Elvis Presley's wife? Would she be strong enough to withstand the pressures of fame, the rumors, the temptations that swirled constantly around him? In her memoirs, Priscilla would later admit that her engagement brought both happiness and unease. The ring represented love, but also responsibility. It was not just a commitment to Elvis, the man she adored. It was a commitment to Elvis, the legend, with all the complexity that entailed. I realized that marrying Elvis meant more than becoming a wife, she reflected. It meant giving myself completely to his world. Elvis, too, was aware of the gravity of the moment. In private, he reassured her, holding her hand as if to steady not only her fears but his own. He spoke of the future they would build together, a future where she would no longer feel like an outsider but a partner. Yet even as he said the words, there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. For all his fame and fortune, Elvis remained a man who longed for stability, for a home life that fame could never provide. In giving Priscilla that ring, he wasn't just giving her a promise, he was also asking for salvation, for a love strong enough to carry him through the turbulence of being Elvis Presley. This was the true turning point. The gift had shifted their relationship from companionship into destiny, binding them in a way that neither could step back from. For Priscilla, it was the moment her youth gave way to responsibility. For Elvis, it was the moment he admitted that love, real love, required risk, commitment, and faith. Together, they had crossed a threshold, stepping into a future that would test them as much as it would unite them. The months that followed Elvis's Christmas proposal were filled with both excitement and scrutiny. For Priscilla, wearing the engagement ring meant stepping into an entirely new role, not just as Elvis's companion, but as his future wife. The world now looked at her differently. She was no longer simply the young woman living quietly at Graceland. She was the woman Elvis Presley had chosen, the one who would share his name. That reality brought joy, but also immense pressure. Throughout early 1967, the couple's engagement was a subject of constant attention. The press hounded for details, fans speculated endlessly, and every appearance together was dissected for meaning. Priscilla, still only 21, found herself learning quickly how to balance the private tenderness of their relationship with the public spectacle it had become. She leaned on Elvis, who often reassured her that despite the noise, what mattered most was the bond they shared behind closed doors. Their wedding plans, however, carried the unmistakable mark of Elvis's world: grand, extravagant, and meticulously orchestrated. On May 1st, 1967, they were married at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. The ceremony, though brief, was attended by close friends, family, and the ever-present media. Priscilla wore a beaded white gown with a 3-foot veil, while Elvis stood proudly beside her in a black tuxedo. For many, it was a fairy tale moment. The king had found his queen. But beyond the glamour of that day, the deeper truth lay in what the proposal had already changed. The surprise gift of the ring had shifted the foundation of their relationship. No longer was Priscilla waiting in the wings of Elvis's life. She was now central to his story. For Elvis, the act of proposing had been more than fulfilling an expectation. It was his acknowledgement that he needed her presence, her loyalty, her grounding influence. In his own way, the engagement was both a declaration of love and a plea for stability. Their marriage, like all marriages, was a blend of joy and struggle. Priscilla found herself navigating the complexities of being Elvis's wife, managing a household often crowded with friends, dealing with long separations while he toured or filmed, and facing the constant pressures of fame. Yet she also discovered strength in her role, finding her voice and identity even as she stood beside one of the most recognizable figures in the world. For Elvis, marriage brought moments of peace amid the whirlwind of his career. He cherished the sense of home that Priscilla provided, the quiet conversations at Graceland that contrasted with the chaos of his public life. Though challenges inevitably arose, especially as the years went on, the moment he placed that ring on her finger remained a defining act of devotion. His way of saying that beyond the fame and the fans, there was one person he wanted to anchor his world. Looking back, Priscilla would later reflect on how that proposal had forever changed her life. It was not just the beginning of her marriage to Elvis, it was the moment she stepped into adulthood, into responsibility, into a role that required resilience and courage. The engagement ring, glittering under the Christmas lights of 1966, symbolized more than romance. It marked the point where their love story became a shared destiny. The story of Elvis Presley's surprise gift to Priscilla in December 1966 is more than just a romantic chapter in their lives. It is the moment that forever altered the course of their love. What began as a private exchange beneath the glow of Christmas lights became the foundation of a future that bound them together in both joy and challenge. With a single ring, Elvis not only declared his devotion, but also acknowledged the responsibility of making their love permanent, of turning years of companionship into a promise that would withstand the weight of fame. For Priscilla, that night was transformative. She stepped into the role of fiancée, not as a passive figure, but as a young woman suddenly carrying the expectations of being the wife of the world's most iconic entertainer. It required strength, resilience, and grace far beyond her years. For Elvis, the proposal revealed his deepest vulnerability, the longing for stability, for a home that fame alone could never provide. The ring was more than diamonds and gold. It was his way of anchoring himself to love in a world that constantly tried to pull him away from it. Though their marriage would face trials and eventually end in divorce, the significance of that Christmas proposal cannot be diminished. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that tested their bond, shaped their identities, and left an indelible mark on both of their lives. For Elvis, it was proof that even the king of rock and roll longed for something no stage or spotlight could give, the quiet certainty of love. For Priscilla, it was the moment she transitioned from being part of Elvis's world to becoming central to his story. And perhaps that is why this moment continues to resonate today, because at its heart it reminds us that love is not about perfection. It is about commitment. It is about choosing one another, again and again, even when the road ahead is uncertain. So I leave you with this: what has been the most meaningful gift you have ever received? Not in value, but in impact. Has someone ever given you something that changed not just a moment, but the direction of your life? Share your thoughts in the comments and reflect on how love, in its purest form, is less about what we give and more about the promises we make.